so much, Carolyn, for that special music. There is in the book of Esther an encouraging message for anyone who has ever experienced heartache, who has been hurt by life, who sees his or her past so fractured that it is so bad there's no way any good could ever come from it. But the all-powerful, sovereign, invisible God has been working behind the scenes in every life, and that includes yours and mine. Only such a gracious, omniscient God would have noticed a poor young orphan girl whose parents just died. Years later, this young girl would, by divine providence, become the queen of the largest kingdom on earth and would save her people, the Hebrews, from genocide. She would rightly be told by a man who had keen discernment, who knows? He wasn't that sure, but he was dead right. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Now, when the book of Esther begins, we're brought into the royal palace to observe a grand banquet. We are stunned at the wealth, the luxury, the materialism, the abundance of food and wine. We observe here high government officials, military officers in attendance, the elite of society are present. The Persian Empire has all the riches that anyone could want, but present too are greed, lust, foolish, and misery. Living in Persia, ancient Persia, were many thousands of Jews, the people of God, who should not have been there. God wanted them to have left years ago when the authorities allowed them to leave Persia and return to Israel. They were not like the psalmist who uttered, "May my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I forget Jerusalem." But the Persian Jews forgot Jerusalem, but God did not forget them, disobedient though they were. The theology of this book teaches that God cares for and protects his children. He humbles the proud and exalts the lowly, and he blesses those who trust in him. Providence also teaches that the Creator is in complete control of everything, everybody, everywhere, forever. Providence comes from two Latin words. The first is a preposition prof, which means before, ahead of time, and video, to see ahead of time. Because God sees far ahead into the future of your life, he sees everything that's coming your way. So he starts working in advance to order your circumstances to accomplish not your will for your life, but his. Now, I assume that we all know what these are. Gallows. Gallows are a simple but crude scaffolding erected to hang criminals on. In ancient Persia, such gallows were built unjustly to hang a godly man on named Mordecai by an evil man, Haman. But the providential Lord saw that coming in advance and making plans to reverse the evil plot. God had the evil Haman, who erected those gallows, hanged on them, and the godly man, Mordecai, replaced Haman as Persia's prime minister. What then are the gallows in your life? Poor health, deteriorating marriage, grief over an unsaved loved one, a rebellious child, financial struggles. Heaven plans to bring good out of your gallows as he brought good out of Mordecai's gallows. Amen. So this morning we're going to look at Esther chapter 1. And I'd like to sum it up in one sentence. Here it is. Seeing the end from the beginning, providence removes the current sitting queen in order to replace her with a divinely chosen successor who was once that little orphan girl Esther, who was adopted by her older cousin Mordecai. And our passage is going to break down in these 4 paragraphs. Verses 1 through 9 concerns royal banquets. This should be 10 through 11, royal summons. 12 through 16, royal refusal, and lastly, royal decree. So this morning I want you to begin the first of a 10-week series on the book of Esther. Now, just out of curiosity, I'd like to know how many of you in the past have heard at least one sermon from the book of Esther. May I see your hand? Oh, that's pretty good. I can't raise my hand because I've never heard anybody ever preach on the book of Esther. But it's in the Old Testament, inspired by God. God believes it's to our advantage, our profit, to know this book. Now, a handout has been provided for you. Does anybody lack that handout? If you don't use the handout, please open a Bible and read along with me. Now, verses 1 through 3 are going to give us the who, the where, and the when. I'm in verse 1. Now, what happened the Hebrew says, in the days of Ahasuerus. I want you to know this expression, it happened in the days of, is used a number of times in the Old Testament, which signals trouble and woe on the way. It happened in the lifetime of Ahasuerus. Now, 3 times in the first 2 verses, this title, and I really think that Ahasuerus is not so much the king's name as it is a title like Pharaoh or like Caesar. Now, which Ahasuerus are we talking about? The Ahasuerus who ruled from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So this book opens in the realm of wealth, luxury, power, innumerable servants, magnificent buildings, all of which the world seeks, yet the fabulously impressive empire has no happiness, only greed, vanity, and humiliation. Now, verse 2 gives the king's location. In those days, when King Ahasuerus occupied the royal throne that was in Susa, the palace fortress. Now, I want you to know that in Susa, the capital, the palace was a fortified complex that sat on top of a hill 120 feet in the air for safety. Down at the foot of that hill, spread out, was the capital city of Susa. This book will address the relation between the interest of human government, which often conflicts with the interest of God's kingdom. Brian made reference to it this morning, that Trump has been elected. There are not a few people, politicians, people in position of authority who deeply dislike Trump. Well, I dislike his crude, obnoxious, arrogant behavior. I didn't vote for Barack Obama twice. I didn't like his policies. I didn't like the way he thought. But he became my president. I voted against Joe Biden. I didn't like his policy, but he became my president. And when those 2 men became my president, I started praying for their safety. I started praying that God would bless their hand and make them successful. If the president, whoever is occupying the Oval Office, is successful, we, the citizens of this country, are successful as well. Amen. Ronald Reagan used to call North Korea, Iran, and Russia the axis of evil, the evil kingdom. And it's amazing how the devil is entrenched in governments like Red China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and you can just see they just breathe evil. And that's what we're going to have in this ancient Persian empire. Now, verse 3 identifies the event that will lead to Esther. In the third year of his reign, he held a banquet for all his officials and civil servants. And actually, the Hebrew word banquet's a little bit of a misnomer. It really means drinking bout. In the third year of his reign, he held a banquet for all his officials and civil servants, military officers of Persia and Media, the elite with governors of the provinces, all of them present. So, ordinary days. And that's what this was to Esther. Ordinary days can become extraordinary, so different, so pivotal that they change the entire course of a person's life. Esther knows nothing about this banquet. In fact, she's not even invited, but it's going to alter her life. Now, verse 4 informs us of one thing the king was doing in this banquet. When he was displaying the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180, that's almost half a year this banquet went on. Now, what you think about it? he had assembled the major leaders, the major officers in his army. Most of the powerful authorities were assembled for 6 months in one city. How irresponsible was it to leave the managing of this vast empire from India to Ethiopia in the hands of lesser authorities? But this king was not a wise, practical man. There was an inscription found that quotes this king. He calls himself the great king, the king of kings, the king of lands occupied by many races, the king of this great world. He had a huge ego problem. He wants to showcase his wealth, and that is the pride of life. Here's what 2 Kings 20 says about what he did. Hezekiah did the same thing. Hezekiah welcomed them, future adversaries, and he showed them all his treasure house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oils, his armory, and all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in his house or in his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. Now, here's the way 1 John 2:16 puts it. All that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life is not from God, but from the world. Now, when ancient Jews read the book of Esther, when you and I read what this man and his realm, the Persian kingdom, were like, we sense something is not right with their heart. Things cannot possibly end well for such a man as this. And that's why the godly writer, Psalm 49, put it this way. Why should I fear times of trouble when the iniquity of those who cheat me surround me, those who trust in their wealth and boast of the abundance of their riches? For he sees that even the wise die, the fool and the stupid alike must perish and leave their wealth to others. Their graves are their homes forever, their dwelling places to all generations, though they call their lands by their own names. Man in his pomp will not remain. He is like the beasts that perish. This is the path of those who have foolish confidence, yet after them people approve of their boast. Like sheep they are appointed for the grave. Death shall be their shepherd. So godly people who hear of the likes of this king and their kingdom, we sense things are not good in spite of all the wealth and the assets that they have. Now, in the 5th verse, the curtain comes down on this 6-month banquet for leaders, and the curtain rises on a banquet in Susa just for common people. I'm in verse 5. Now, when these days were ended, the king held a feast for all the people who were present in Susa, the capital, from the greatest to the least. They are very aware of the social pecking order and where they fit in. For 7 days in the court of the garden in the king's palace. So this banquet's going to last just 7 days, not for 6 months. Now, verse 6 describes the royal court. And I want you to know, in the Hebrew text, the language here is rough and harsh. There are no verbs in verse 6. It's as though the writer, and he may well have stood in this court, he is just flabbergasted with the wealth that he sees. I want you to know, archaeologists have found this court, and it fits exactly with what is said here. Now look at verse 6. Remember, no verbs here. Very harsh language. It's like he's just struck with amazement. White and blue draperies, held by cords of fine linen on rings of silver and marble columns. Couches made of gold and silver. Is there any furniture in your house made of gold or silver? Maybe just an ashtray or a spittoon? Nothing like that in my home. Set on a pavement of porphyry and marble and mother of pearl and precious stones. This court, archaeologists have measured, was 3.5 football fields long and 2.5 football fields wide. It boasted of extraordinary luxury. Now, verse 7 concerns the banquet's refreshments. And drinks were served in golden goblets, with goblets differing from each other in design. Moreover, the royal wine was abundant according to the king's authority. The focus is on drinking. Now, verse 8 turns from the drinking goblets to the amount of wine served. Since the royal wine was abundant, according to verse 7, we might assume that all the ghosts consumed as much as possible. Look at the first word in verse 8. However, that wasn't the case. Now, this is going to be a bit surprising. The amount of drinking was according to the directive, no compulsion. For the king had so ordered every one of his palace stewards to serve each guest according to his own wishes. Now, this is ironic. The king shows deference to his guests. Do not make them drink any more than they want, yet he will show no deference to his own king in a few minutes. Now, one lady that Sue and I are close to put it this way to me. My husband treats all the women in our church better than he treats me. How wrong is that? But here we have a king doing the same thing. He is very sensitive to his guests, not the slightest sensitive to his wife. Now, verse 9 turns to his wife and mentions a third banquet, this one for women only. And Vashti held a banquet for women in the royal palace which belonged to Ahasuerus. Now, her real name, by the way, Proverbs 16:18. Pride comes before destruction, and an arrogant spirit before a fall. Okay, so we see what's coming to this proud, arrogant man. Now, the queen's real name was a mistress, but he gave her the pet name Vashti, which means the best, the nicest, the prettiest. And she must have been a gorgeous knockout. But her fate is about to be decided by unbridled drunkenness. Now, after showing off his wealth, the king wants to show off his chief asset, that's his wife, as if she belongs in the same category as pretty things. Verse 10. On the seventh day, now here's the final day of the feast. On the seventh day, when the king's heart was glad with wine. Now let's stop right there. That's a very nice way to put it. We have euphemism here. What's euphemism? Replacing a socially offensive remark with a more socially acceptable one. He was drunk. He was dead drunk. He ordered Mecumen, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagthon, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the king's presence. Now, Herodotus was a Greek historian, and he wrote this about the Persians. The Persians make their most important decisions when drunk. Now, here's what Proverbs says about that. It is not for kings. It is not for kings to drink wine or for rulers to take strong drink. Now, you might remember the name Stonewall Jackson. He was a serious Christian. He was a very skilled soldier in the Civil War, the American Civil War. It's just that he fought for the wrong side. He didn't fight for the North. He fought for the Southern Confederacy. But he's a very serious Christian. And one day a friend asked him, do you abstain from alcohol because you don't like it? He said, no, I abstain from it because I do like it. And it can get me in trouble. Well, he had some wisdom that the king of Persia did not have. Now, verse 11 tells us what the king's order in verse 10 was. He sent 7 of his servants to bring his wife to the banquet. Verse 11, to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king, wearing her royal crown. This will enhance her majestic appearance in order to display her beauty to the people and the officials because she was very beautiful. Here is my trophy wife. Now, you've heard that expression. That man has a trophy wife. She's gorgeous. He likes to show her off out in public. So this is the climax of the banquet. And Josephus, a Jewish historian, tells us in Persia, a man was not allowed to look at another man's wife. Well, the king wants to reverse all of that. And the initial word in verse 12 signals the queen's response not to the king's request, but to his order. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, although it was delivered by the eunuchs. Now, her absence isn't because the eunuchs failed to deliver the message. And by the way, how many eunuchs were necessary? Surely one eunuch, one man would have been enough to inform the queen, the king requests your presence or orders your presence. But 7 eunuchs, this is so typical of the Persians. They just loved excess wealth, excess drinking, excess in everything. So she fails to show up. The queen is a dignified, modest woman, unwilling to have the lustful eyes of drunkards and commoners on her to be degraded. As a result, verse 12 goes on to say, the king became extremely angry. In fact, his rage burned. This king is humiliated unexpectedly before all of his subjects. The king becomes a laughingstock at this banquet. Now, at this point, the king consults his cabinet of counselors. Then the king inquired of his wise men who had knowledge of precedents and protocol, for it was thus the king's custom to consult all who knew law and justice. Now, one of the problems with Ahasuerus was he had trouble making decisions, and he was known to let other people make his decisions for him. One commentator puts it this way: it takes legal experts and Persian aristocracy to formulate a response that most any husband could reach by himself, but he didn't like making decisions. In verse 14 identifies the king's counselors and describes them in 4 ways: by name, by number, by their access to royalty, and that they were the elite of government officials. I'm in verse 14. And near him were Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Barsina, and Memucan, 7 officials of Persia and Media, who had access to the king and who held first rank in the kingdom. Now, verse 13 said the king inquired of his counselors, and verse 14 reveals this question. Legally. Now, let me stop right there. The first word, legally, is very emphatic. The king wants to know what the law says the penalty should be for the queen disobeying the king. But the counselor's answer has nothing to do with the law, but only with their own fear. These counselors are not thinking of what's best for the king, but what's best for themselves. And the king cannot act on his own and make a marital decision, but his counselors will overreact and make a mountain out of a molehill. They're going to turn a domestic issue into a national crisis. Verse 16. Then Memucan replied in the presence of King Ahasuerus, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the officials and all the people who live in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. In other words, your wife offended the entire nation. Actually, this makes the queen's decision worse than what it really was. Now, verse 17 explains how the queen's offense affects everybody, at least in the mind of this counselor. To elaborate, the queen's conduct will become public knowledge to all women so as to cause them to despise their husbands. The counselor doesn't fear all citizens will despise and disobey the king, but that all husbands will be scorned by their wives. Since they were broadcast, King Ahasuerus ordered Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, but she did not come. Now, because she was insubordinate to her husband, does that mean all wives will be? No, that's what he's afraid of. Verse 17 concerns women in general. Verse 18 concerns women in the capital city. And this very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media who heard of the queen's conduct will regularly repeat it toward all the king's officials. That's us guys, resulting in plenty of disrespect from our wives and anger stirred up in us husbands. So the women of high society will be influenced by the queen to speak to us, the royal officials, in the same disrespectful way, O king, she spoke to you. We are all, the counselor is saying, in for a lot of trouble because of your unsubmissive queen. In verse 19, the counselor gives his advice. If it is pleasing to the king. Now I want you to know that statement is found 5 times in this little short book, and another 6 times this statement is found. If it seems good to the king. You know what the counselors are doing? Everything in this entire empire ought to please you. What's the word for it when a person wants the world to revolve around his wishes and desire? Isn't that what's called a
megalomaniac?
Well, no, that's one who puffs himself up, and this king does that. Narcissist, that's right. Narcissism. The world revolves around. We're dealing with a husband and wife now in another state, and the husband's a narcissist. He thinks everything his wife does, everything that happens in his home, in his church, should revolve around what he wants. And here these counselors are making a monster out of their king. So verse 19, if it is pleasing to the king, let a royal decree be issued from his presence, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so it cannot be repealed. Now, why do they want the law that can't be repealed? Should Queen Vashti be put back in her position, who's she going to be angry at? Us counselors who advise you to get rid of her and replace her. We don't want her breathing fire on us. So we want a law passed that can't be repealed, to the effect that Vashti may never again come into the king Ahasuerus' presence, and let the king give her position to another woman better than she. Now, there's irony here. This counselor thinks the worst fate to befall the queen is banishment from the king's presence, but this is precisely what she wanted. Not to be in his presence. This is like taking Burr Rabbit and throwing him where? Into the briar patch. The fox didn't think he wanted to be thrown there. That's exactly where he wanted to go. And the irony is, God will have another queen better than Vashti, and this is exactly what God did to her husband, King Ahasuerus. Speaking of another king, 1 Samuel 15, Samuel said to him, King Saul, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. God does that. God set King Saul on the throne, and because he was so rebellious to God, God removed him from the throne. In my humble opinion, as I interpret our American politics,
that's right.
Joe Biden was put in the Oval Office by the permission of God, maybe by the hand of God.
Yes.
As punishment to us,
yes,
for our country. But the same God who put him there also removed him.
That's right.
Now, in verse 20, the counselor forecasts the expected outcome of his advice. You take my advice and everything's going to be hunky-dory for us. When the king's edict, which he will publish, I'm so sure you're going to follow my sage advice. When the king's edict, which is published, is heard throughout all the kingdom, for it is massive in extent. In other words, you have such a big empire with so many husbands and wives. We got to get this done right, or we're going to have marriages everywhere up in turmoil. All wives will respect their husbands from the greatest to the last. The counselor is sure that wifely respect can be imposed by royal decree. Husbands then don't have to earn the right of being respected by being gentlemen. No, we can order the wives to respect their husbands, which can't be done. Verse 21 records the king's response. And this proposal was pleasing in the opinion of the king. The counselor told the king what he wanted to hear. And so the king did as Becunum had proposed. Now, one commentator says this, working behind the scene, God is working and rearranging the events and changing minds until he brings out of the most carnal and secular of settings a decision that will set his perfect plan in motion. Now, the appropriate outcome of following the counselor's advice is recorded in verse 22. Accordingly, he sent letters to all the king's providences, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, that every man must remain ruler of his own house. That sort of implies all husbands are about on the verge of losing control of their home. And that every man must remain the ruler in his own house and speak the language of his own people. Now, what that means is, in a big kingdom like Persia, remember, it was made up of 60 different countries. America's made up of 50 states. But the Persian Empire was made up of 60 different countries and many races. And so when a man and a woman married, they often were from different countries and spoke different languages. Usually, when they married, the wife's native tongue was spoken in the house, and the king is saying, we're going to stop all of that. Husbands, you marry a woman who's not from your people, from another country, but since you live in this empire, the language of your native home will be spoken, not the language of your wife. And that's to ensure that she understands your orders and that you are viewed as the head of the home. So, let's sum up. What we have here so far is a huge gathering at a royal banquet, a drunken king, 6 months of blatant display of carnal appetites by men, and an uncooperative queen. But God's hand is not removed from this scene. Yet Esther does not know any of this is going on, but it will determine her future. So what practical applications could this chapter have for you and me? Number one, Haman erected gallows to hang Mordecai on. Providence reversed this evil plan. Haman was hanged on his own gallows, and Mordecai took his place as prime minister of Persia. God reversed everything. Now, you remember I told you that I just found out in April that a man 56 years ago had plotted my death. I didn't know that. Somebody did. And his plan to have me killed was reversed. The man he didn't want killed was the one killed. I just thank God that happened and I did not even know it. Secondly, now I want to ask again, what are your gallows? Declining health, deteriorating marriage, abuse from an adversary, grief over an unbelieving loved one, financial struggles. God plans to use your gallows, or as Jesus called it, he who comes after me must pick up his cross and bear it. We all have a cross. Or to borrow Esther's language, we all have a gallows somewhere in our life. It's bad. We don't like it. We wouldn't want it for a minute. We would wish that gallows, that cross away. But God brings so out of his wisdom incredible good out of incredible bad. Thirdly, King Ahasuerus indulged in everything the world craves: wealth, luxuries, materialism, harems, innumerable servants, the finest of foods and beverages, advisors, handsome looks, the ruler of earth's greatest empire, a royal reputation, yet he was empty, corrupt, and miserable. Scripture reminds us to flee such things and pursue the real riches of life, righteousness, faith, love, with those of a pure heart. All of this stuff that he gorged on, the more he gorged on the world, the more miserable he became. In fact, he offered a reward to anybody in his kingdom that could invent another pleasure for him. He had so much of a high life, the good food, women, and sex, he was bored stiff. So can anybody come up with a new way of amusing me and helping me find pleasure in another way? For a poor orphan young girl, Esther had nothing going for her except divine providence, and that was more than enough. Heaven had an older pious cousin adopt and raise her, and eventually God made her the queen of Persia. You have the same divine providence working in your behalf. Now, there was a contest throughout all of Persia. The king, when he got rid of Queen Vashti, who was never allowed in his presence again, he wanted another woman, another king, another queen. So he had the most beautiful, attractive women in all of Persia brought to Susa, and he met them one by one. In other words, he had a royal beauty contest. And probably there were other women there more attractive than Esther, more intelligent, more articulate, more gifted. Why was she chosen? That was no accident. That she was chosen to be queen less by the king and more by the King of Kings. Why? God's going to use her to save all of the Jews from being executed because Haman hates the Jews. Anti-Semitism has been alive and doing quite well ever since God chose the Jewish people. 5, there will be events occurring that you are ignorant of. I didn't know for 56 years that somebody was planning my death. Yet they will eventually play a huge part in your life. And brother, did it ever. There will come a day that seems ordinary, nothing special, yet your entire life can turn on it, and it will lead to your divinely planned destiny. And lastly, only from the Lord comes a person's steps, our decisions, our circumstances, the positions we hold, the directions that we go, our family, our friends, as I've asked you before. How many of you here chose your father? Anybody here select the womb you came out of? Did you determine your gender, your intelligence, your looks, what time in history you would live, etc., etc.? None of us do that. Somebody else has done all of that. Only from the Lord come our steps. The sovereign God had her, Esther, come to the kingdom for such a time as this, to prevent the Jewish people from being annihilated. Heaven has a specific plan tailor-made for each of us, and for most saints, the best part of that wonderful plan will be their teenage years. No. In their 20s. No. We're too dumb and stupid to know which end of the stick is up. The older we get, the more experienced we become, the more knowledge we pick up. If we walk with God, we become more spiritual. We have more to offer people, and in our latter years, those can be the best, most satisfying years of our life. So, Heavenly Father, how thankful we are that if it pleases you, then we shall live and do this or that. We are so grateful that we're not in control of our life, nor that drunk driver that we may meet on the highway this week, or some criminal who's lying in wait for us, or some disease, some virus that just ends up in our drinking water. We're so grateful, Lord, that you hold our breath and heartbeat in your hands. And not only that, you have a plan, a purpose. There are no accidents in our life. Now, may we be those who trust you, especially when adversaries attack, especially when circumstances are bad, especially when friends betray us, confident that you're in control. You love us. You have a plan for our life, and you are determined to bring it about. And may we see and experience your goodness as Esther did. In Jesus' name, amen.